Alright, as we continue on with our 2024 movies, both newer and earlier in the year, I want to talk about these few, a couple of which I didn't even mean to kind of put together like this, but I guess for these first two movies, we're going to be talking about just some really, really toxic ass relationships and kind of looking at how, even though these are situations we'd probably never want to be in with other people, toxic relationships can make really good and enthralling movies, apparently. So, I guess that's why reality TV is a thing, too. But, to look at these movies, plus Immaculate, I want to start with Challengers, which is one of those movies that was kind of getting a reputation before it even came out. And both of these, Challengers and Love Lies Bleeding, both kind of had this reputation of being, like, sexy as far as how they were being sort of pushed and advertised and stuff like that, and the sort of pre-hype behind them. And in Challengers' case first, there is something here that is very intoxicating in a way that's kind of hard to explain without actually seeing it. Like, it's one of those. It's really easy to kind of sit back and say, "Oh, the movie's like kind of got this particular sort of charge to it, and the chemistry and the relationships and all that." But it's like this Challengers especially has such a visual style and performances and chemistry that you have to see to believe. If I were to just sit here and tell you that there's a certain vibe to this movie, I don't think it would do it justice, because this movie is alive in a way I feel like I haven't seen a movie in a while, or at least it stands out to this degree. But to get to something a bit more simple, first of all, I had an idea going into this of it was just like you look at the title and you know it's a tennis movie. You get the idea of, oh, it's probably about competitive tennis, and that's about all I really knew. I'm glad to learn that I apparently wasn't alone when it first came out and when I was kind of first seeing it, like when it first started, because my first thought was, so are these real people? Because it really does feel like, and that's, a major asset to the movie, that it actually puts us in such a real feeling with these characters that I guess a lot of people did kind of question that at the start. It's like, sure, this must be a true story or something, or these must be real people. I mean, God, to a certain extent, I guess God forbid these would be real people, but no, that's fantastic though. That it very much feels like that. It's as it goes on, it's kind of like you get the vibe that, oh, this is obviously a fictional movie, and these aren't, because this is totally something we would have heard about if these were real people. But no, they do a very good job setting up the vibe that it could have been like in this world. It's a very look at this world that feels very real in itself. And talking about just the charge in this movie and the very sort of alive nature of it, the fact that it's just never going to let that up at all as soon as it starts. They set that vibe perfectly also by starting in this very surprising way of us getting a little bit of a glimpse at the characters in their most sort of tense moment, like the most tense moment in their story, before we see the opening logo, before we see the MGM logo. We just get a little bit of what's going on here in this sort of final match, which is something that I feel like it's very rare. I can't remember the last time I saw something like it had like a little cold open before we even got the logos. It happens in like Marvel movies, but other than that, it's pretty uncommon. So that's something that's really just tells you right away that it's gonna pull you in, and this is not gonna stop until the end credits start, which is a really exciting feeling. And just looking at them in general in the physicality at the start here, before we even get to the relationships of the characters, before we even know the relationships of the characters, just looking at Mike Feist and Josh O'Connor specifically, and then obviously later Zendaya and her scenes, having the look and feel like professional tennis players is something that really sets up vibe. Where I was talking about how they're not real people, but a lot of people kind of made that mistake going into it, thinking it could be. You just look at their physicality, and they just look like they're this is something that's already such a lived-in world, and these are characters that have been doing this probably their whole lives, which is fantastic. Because you have three actors here in particular who are really... Like, I feel like Mike Feist and his background especially kind of comes from that vibe of these are actors, and we talked about this with Dune also, which was also Zendaya, this sort of new batch of, like, younger actors that have been coming in and been setting their place here in the industry, and coming from this place of, I will basically do anything to make this feel as real, and commit to this as hard as I possibly can. And these are also just really shining examples of that, and this really rich new set of actors we have coming in that's like kind of growing too, that are kind of in like their early 30s and setting up this new sort of wave of just incredible, just the actors that just really, really go for it as much as they can. And so, whether it be physicality or method or whatever it is. So, to put the focus on one character, obviously we can start with Zendaya and her character, Tashi, who's very... One of the things about her magnetism here is the fact that I feel like this character... This is a character that'll benefit a lot from multiple viewings of this movie to really try to understand where she's coming from. It's one of those cases where once you really start to fall in love with the movie and her performance and trying to figure out what exactly is going on here with the relationships and where everybody stands, it kind of becomes a thing of how much do you really want to know? Like, how much of the fun of this character is the fact that she's just really hard to read, and you don't know which direction she's going to go at any given time, or what her motivation is at any given time, or what it is that she wants at the end. I guess if there's one thing at the end of the day that she wants more than anything, it's for tennis to be played at its absolute peak, whether it be by her or by the people that are in her life or that she cares about. Whatever it is, just if good tennis exists, that's where her happy place is, and everything else is kind of almost like a pawn to get to that feeling, I guess. But there's always questions throughout of to what extent she cares about particular characters. Because there is definitely a sort of coldness to her at the beginning, when we see her as, like, Art's sort of Lady Macbeth to his career. And the fractured timeline helps us a lot too, because we're basically starting at the end, and then we're kind of going back and forth the whole time. It almost seems like it could be too much, the cutting back and forth, but the way it sort of answers... The great thing about it is when you see, like, a fractured timeline, sometimes it can get a bit dull if you've seen it too many times, because it's that case of, oh, what's this? I have questions about this. But then, like, if you're kind of bored of that, or it's something you've seen over and over again, and you feel like it's played out, you could just think, well, I don't really have to be that, committed to this, because they're just going to tell me at some point, whether it be half an hour from now or 2 hours from now, it's going to be some reveal of what this means or whatever. But the way it goes back and forth to these specific periods of time, even when it goes back and is seemingly answering a question we may have had about what's going on in the future, there's still another point that's going to throw off kind of what we thought we knew or what we thought a character was feeling, and it's basically just fucking with us the whole time. It's basically... Tashi's basically fucking with everybody in one way or another, whether it be Art or Patrick or us, it feels like, by the way the timeline's set up. So, watching that and watching her handle that, where she's just really hard to read a lot of time, especially her scenes with Patrick, are still, like, I feel like you could watch this movie 5 times, and her scenes with Patrick especially, there's still a mysterious vibe to her of what exactly is she feeling? Is it anything at all what she's saying? Is it, like... And the way they bounce off each other, and they have that sort of verbal sparring that they do, basically whenever they're face-to-face in the story. And how kind of different that is with her and Art's relationship, where it does seem like she's much more in control. But Art also seems like somebody... Art's another character, and Mike Feist's performance also, where at first, like, you talk about the idea of breaking up, like, teams. Like, you can go in this movie and say, like, oh, are you Team Art or are you Team Patrick? Or there's even probably even a Team Toshi also, if you think about it. But the idea of it seems like the first time I saw it, because I've seen it twice now, it felt pretty clear cut to me that I was on the side that Art was the least of a piece of shit of the three of them. But when you watch it again and you see the way Art sort of like plants seeds in a way that may not be as innocent as it seems, and there's something much more calculating about him than it kind of seems like on the surface, because it seems like he's kind of almost like the pushover of the group if there was one. But you can see the details in all the characters when you go back and look really closely. And it's like basically everybody's a piece of shit to one extent or another. And it's the idea of how much you're going to commit to that as an audience member. And I wasn't completely sure about it the first time, but I think it's one of those cases where when you're set up for it, and you know all the characters are kind of playing each other in different sort of ways, in many different ways of that word, there's something really intriguing about this. And like I said, I was talking about the toxic relationship thing, where it's like, if it's your jam to watch that happen, even if it's a situation you would not want to be in by any means, the movie does make it look very exciting and enticing in this way where just everybody is bad news, though. Which can be some of the most entertaining characters and dynamics when you know everybody is a certain extent of a piece of shit. And this movie just basks in that in the most glorious fashion. And it's like watching these people verbally spar and get one over on the other and all that, just back and forth constantly. And you talk about the competitiveness of the sport itself versus what's going on in their lives. But and that got me sidetracked from the Zendaya performance, because there is also, because it feels like we're getting to kind of different Toshis in this a little bit. There's the before and after of her injury, and the thing about it is, whether she's younger or whether she's older in post-injury, she always sort of has not just that commanding presence in the movie, but that commanding nature over the two of them. In the hotel scene specifically, we see how she sort of takes control of the situation and kind of uses them for her own sort of entertainment, and to get to her end goal of just seeing really great tennis played. But when we get to those points later also, she seems like, even though she was, younger in the earlier scenes, but she had this sort of nature to her that we could see in that hotel scene. You would think post-injury, there's like, we kind of see her at her low point. We see her at her weakest. When she's just at this really tragic point where she realizes she's probably not going to play again. And it's like, even regardless of what we've seen before, it's genuinely tragic and genuinely heartbreaking to see her in this situation where she had this entire future, and just with one wrong step, it's just gone. And we just see how much that breaks her. That scene where she's sitting at the tree, specifically, just really, really hurts. But then, after that, it's like she becomes even more ruthless. It's like her kind of villain origin story, while also being this tragic story at the same time. While also being very entertaining to see what exactly she'll do to get to her end goal. Even if, number one, we don't know what that goal is, and number two, whoever gets, run over in the process. Like I said, not something you'd want in your actual life, but watching it as a movie is just, it hardly gets better than that. And like I said, that's basically what this movie thrives on. And so you can even see that in moments, like the very opening scene, when they're playing and the crowd's watching, the ball go back and forth, and then it's like, she's turning also, but she's slightly out of sync with the rest of the crowd. So it's like you get the vibe that she's watching them in a completely different way than the rest of the crowd. And this is before we know anything about either one of their relationships. And so even the visual way Toshi's story is being told is really fantastic and really vivid. Even if, like I said, there's still those constant mystery elements to it that keep that intrigue and that magnetism to it. because there's even, because I was talking about the coldness of her and their relationship, particularly with Art, where obviously in these modern day scenes or these current scenes, they're married and they have a daughter, but there's this distance where it still feels like there's not a lot that we know. Like, at one point he says that he loves her, and she Han Solos him and says, "I know." And you kind of get a sense of a coldness there, but there's also the relationship with, like, Art and their daughter, where, like, we see her putting their daughter to bed, and they say they're gonna watch, Into the Spider-Verse and stuff like that, and there's, like, a mother-daughter relationship there, and it's like, there was a lot of them, because we come in the middle of it, there was a lot of the movie where I assumed Art was, like, maybe a stepdad or something, before we got kind of the information about where they came from, like, this sort of, the first couple of scenes, because there's, like, one scene where he has a moment with the daughter, and he's sleeping in this scene. Where Zendaya, like, comes back and he's, like, asleep in the bed with her, and it's like, that's, like, the only father-daughter moment we see between them. So you just get the sense in general that there's this sort of emptiness in their quote-unquote family, I guess you could say. But... And there's, like, there's no interaction between Art and her mom, either. But then there's a later scene where she's talking to Patrick, and we get a vibe that, like, Patrick is well aware of who her mom is, and, like, asks how her mom is and stuff like that. So it's, like, just little things like that, to, like, see which characters interact versus which ones don't even interact. And no particular attention is drawn to this. It's just something you kind of have to observe. And it's so rich in character just by looking at it. And that's not even to do with the fact that when these characters do have dialogue, it's just enthralling. Like, we talked about the verbal sparring matches she has with Patrick. There's the ones that Art and Patrick have, whether it be friendly or malicious or somewhere in between, some ambiguous place in between. But, like, the churro scene has been talked about a lot. And, like, when I saw it in the theater, like, it didn't really occur to me that it was, like, there was a certain sort of, like, suggestive element to that. And then it's like I was watching it the second time, and it was like, this is really good dialogue and a really great back and forth, but I don't really see the suggestive nature of it. And then there's the moment where Art reaches across and takes a bite out of Patrick's, and it's like, oh, there it is. I get, okay, the whole context of the scene is here now. I got it now. And so just stuff like that. Like I said, stuff that would even just, like, go by unacknowledged the first time you see it. There's just so many details like that. And yeah, they seem blatant in retrospect, sure, some of them. But there's just so much going on between the characters. And like I said, but the way the timeline is, you kind of really have to catch these moments in advance, and then when they pay off in a really big way, if you've noticed, like, all the moments. And that's... And think about that. When you think about these characters, these performances, these actors, just think about how difficult it is when you're watching, like, a romance movie or something, or just a movie where the two characters really have to have lightning in a bottle chemistry. And you see that happen between two characters, and you think, it seems almost impossible that something this perfect could come together, that these two actors and these two characters, the way they're written, could give these performances and just leap off the screen like this, where you feel like you've known these people forever, they've known each other forever, and it's just this inherent thing between the two of them, and how hard that is to find with two actors and capture that. This movie does it with three. Where it's like, you can't imagine anybody else in these roles, you can't imagine how these three actors could have come from different places, been hired for this movie, and found something this fucking electric. Where it's like, these people have to have known each other their whole lives, and been practicing acting their whole lives together to have a chemistry that's just this perfect. And like I said, it can't be understated. There's three of them. With two actors, that's almost impossible. And so with this, it's like, it's unbelievable that these scenes exist, where it's like the hotel scene is kind of already becoming iconic in a way that makes perfect sense. because it just seems impossible that 3 characters and 3 actors should work together this well, this believably, this perfectly, to make this scene that escalates in this perfect way and sets off everything that happens in this movie, all the relationships that happen in this movie. And like I said, at a point where most of it happens with, it's a dialogue heavy scene, and then the most telling stuff is through the scenes with no dialogue, or the moments with no dialogue. And it's the thing of like this going from friendship to rivalry, and that's something that's, and it's like, is there another in between there? And it's like what I was talking about with the timeline also, where we're introduced to Art and Patrick at the beginning, and they're in 2 completely different places. Where Art and Tashi are like rich, they're in like this sort of penthouse suite. They're doing Aston Martin ads. They have like billboards and like giant posters and stuff like that. And Patrick comes in and he's sleeping in his car and he hasn't shaved, and he looks at a Dunkin' sandwich like it's the Holy Grail. Somebody else's Dunkin' sandwich like it's the Holy Grail. And it's like they could not be in 2 more different places. And so when he sees a picture of Art and this person that shows him knows that they have a history, it's like at this point in the story, we don't know, we're about to see, we're like 2 seconds away from seeing what their history is. But in this moment, it's like, oh, what's going on here? It must be this big rivalry. It must be this whole, it was always the 2 of them versus each other. And then we immediately cut to this flashback scene and we realize they were on the same team. And then as this progresses, we realize, oh, they were inseparable best friends. It's like, and then it becomes that case, as we see in the hotel scene, where it's like, oh my god, they're like brothers practically. And then it's like, oh no, maybe it's more like closer to lovers than brothers. And it's then just that, and seeing how all of that history was here in these opening scenes, and then sort of coming back and looking at everything in retrospect, and then seeing how everything plays out, and then, like I said, when the malicious nature starts to come in between the 2 of them, it's really wild to watch everything. So that's another case where I feel like the timeline really helps, and it doesn't feel like overkill necessarily. But also just in general, the editing, where it's like the decisions of when we cut back to something. There's some cases where I could see it being a bit frustrating, where it's like just when it feels like we're about to get to the meat of something, we cut back like, a previous 8 years, or we jump forward 8 years or something. Because the time gaps are big. But they are always informing you with that text. Like I said, I can understand if somebody would think maybe it's overkill or it's a lot, but it really does pay off. And I can't really, especially after a second viewing, I can't really think of a place where it's like, oh, I wish they hadn't cut there, or oh, I wish this would have gone a little longer, because it definitely is reaching a point. It's reaching a sort of, if you will, climax between these 3 people. That's just been waiting to happen the whole movie, and I feel like it adds up in kind of a perfect way as far as what we see and when we see it, and like whether it answers questions or whether it doesn't, or whether it raises more questions. Regardless, is yeah, and also sometimes a lack of editing. There's a few like long takes that aren't showy long takes, like the ones that drive me crazy, but like there's a whole fight scene between Patrick and Tashi where it's like, it starts off and they're like kind of, seducing each other, and it looks like it's gonna turn into like a sex scene. And then there starts to kind of get a bit of competitiveness there, and it's like, he kind of feels like she's talking down to him. He feels like she thinks he's lesser, like he's less talented, and he's less, where he needs to be in tennis itself at that level. And the way this progresses into this very real fight that results in her leaving, this is a whole scene that feels like there's no cuts in it. And it feels like one of those typical sort of melodramatic scenes you would see with a lot of cuts in it. But it's like, you don't even realize till the scene is over that there was no cuts in it, because it was just so entrancing watching them go from all these emotions to these different ones, and stuff coming to light that was kind of being repressed and all of that. And it's just, and the whole movie feels like that pretty much. It's one of those cases where it's like, when you're watching it again and you know all the beats to it, it's just like one great memorable scene after the other, where it's like, you're watching it again and it's like, oh, here's the hotel room scene, this is great, or here's the churro scene, here's, the scene where they fight in one take, here's Patrick's awkward date where he ends up they kind of get into a confrontation, him and Tashi. There's a scene where she and Art are at Applebee's, where it's like we kind of get to see Art doing that whole, he's kind of planting seeds, but he also seems like a nice guy, it's kind of hard to read him also. And then the scene outside of that where they get perfectly timed moment where they get startled by trash being taken out. There's that whole thing there, and just any of the tennis scenes, and it's like I haven't even mentioned like the tennis scenes and how frenetic they are, and it's like it would almost seem like too much. Where like we get a lot of perspective of the ball shots and the ball going into the camera and stuff like that. But what's amazing about this is that would seem like overkill, except for the fact that the tennis scene's frenetic nature pretty much feels like it's matched by the electricity in the scenes. It's just the characters being the characters when they're not playing. So it's like it's basically feels like their competitiveness is constantly on. So it's like even when we go to the tennis scenes, it feels like we haven't left anything behind. Like it's all here in the game itself. So that's just I've really grown. I liked it a lot when I saw it in the theater, but I've really grown to love it the more I think about it, and after having seen it a second time. And I imagine multiple viewings will only continue to help it. And the fact that it's just sort of, there's just so many things it could be classified as, like, like with Luca Guadagnino, it's like, is it a prestige movie, or is it like kind of a trashy movie, or is it sexy, or is it sleazy, is it funny, or is it tragic? And it's like, is everybody getting what they deserve or not? And it's there's just this movie got a pretty quick reputation, and it's really easy to see why. And I love that. I love that movies like this can get that sort of something that seems like it would never like I said, you have to find that chemistry. If you didn't have these three actors with the chemistry that they have, this movie would at best be okay, or, good, but it really reaches the greatness of finding this lightning in a bottle chemistry that seems impossible. That's really the key to everything in this movie. Otherwise, it would fall apart very quickly. You'd hate every character. You wouldn't, to the point that it wouldn't be entertaining to watch them. It would just be like, all these people suck. They're so sleazy and self-obsessed and self-absorbed. But you have to have these kind of performances from these actors, I think. I mean, a lot of credit has to be given to the writing, of course, but, like I said, the way it comes to life is going to be a whole other animal in any aspect of movie making, and that's where the real magic is, as far as what your end product looks like at the end of the day, and how it comes off to an audience, and I don't think it could have turned out really any better. It's certainly not with any other three leads, so that's how I feel about that. So to go on to another kind of a lot of toxic relationships in Love, Lies Bleeding, kind of carrying over. So we're in 1989, which I don't think is revealed till like an hour into the movie, but you get a sense that we're in another time period. Apparently it's 1989, and so you're going to kind of have that bit of late 80s feel throughout it. The director is Rose Glass, who did Saint Maud, which is fucking nuts. So it was very exciting when she was doing another movie, and something that kind of went away from the horror of Saint Maud, but into something that's still kind of surreal and scary in its own way. Where just right away we start with these ominous shots of this sort of, I guess a ravine is what you would call it, that's going to play a major part in this story. And like I said, it just sort of sets a vibe immediately, whether it be between music, Clem Mansell, who's one of the most maybe underrated composers working in movies for a very long time now. But there's also something about it where we were talking about challengers and is it sexy or is it sleazy? This is more like, once again, it was kind of marketed in this sort of sexy way and stuff like that, and but the griminess of this movie, where it's like, oh, is it sexy or does it just feel like physically gross and dirty and disgusting? And what I mean by that is we're introduced to Kristen Stewart, and she's unclogging she's unclogging the toilet from Trainspotting, is her opening scene. And that sort of dirty vibe is something that never really leaves the movie, even when it's getting more into the, you know, sexy nature of it, if that's what you want to call it. So we're introduced to her and Katie O'Brien, who is this sort of drifter that comes in who's on her way to a bodybuilding contest in Vegas. And there's something about... I'm not too familiar with her, but this is definitely... I'm going to remember her now, for sure. I'm not sure if I've seen her in anything else off the top of my head that stands out. Certainly not as much as this does. And she's great, but as far as Kristen Stewart goes, who is, like, one of my favorites of the, you know, current generation of actors, the thing is that she's able to do this thing where she's able to get into just about any role at this point. Where, if it was the Twilight days, and you looked at her and you said she's going to get an Oscar nomination for playing Princess Diana, I think people would have thought you were out of your mind. But the way she can really transform now and make it feel like that she's lived in these environments that her characters take place in her whole life. Where you get the sense that, like, when the scene opens and we see Kristen Stewart cleaning a filthy-ass toilet, or unclogging a filthy-ass toilet, you get the vibe this character's lived in this for a long time. There's this jaded independence that comes through, that makes the character really intriguing, especially when we get into these sort of toxic relationships that rely a lot on dependency of other people. And so, when you see the complexity of this character, as we get little tiny glimpses of her background, this is a really solid character, and it definitely has some nuances she has to really discover, and she can do that pretty much flawlessly. This character feels like a real person. In a lot of cases, in this particular movie, is dark. Like, it's a dark fact that these people feel as real as they do. Especially when not just the environment feels kind of grimy and dirty, but some of the characters also, like the Anna Baryshnikov character, who has, like, those yellow teeth the whole time. There's just something like when you imagine movies like this, like, from maybe 10 or 15 years ago, when we were at a time where it's like everybody has to be beautiful, everybody has to look like a model, and it's like to kind of get back into this era of people looking like just real grimy people that you would see, like, every day in particular places, really gives the whole thing this grounded vibe, and that grounded vibe plays a very interesting part in this story when we start getting into the more surreal aspects of it, particularly the Katie O'Brien character, where she starts taking these steroids, I guess, of sorts. It's kind of vague what exactly this drug is. It appears to work like a steroid, but it has effects, some very interesting and dangerous effects, to where she often hallucinates, quite literally hulking out. And she hallucinates her body growing, and she will rage out. And the way this is brought into a plot that involves a sort of crime boss of sorts, or this career criminal that has a bit of an enterprise in Ed Harris, who is also the father of Kristen Stewart. It's wild how many characters this movie introduces, and then shows us within just a span of a few minutes how all of them are connected. Whether it be them, or Ed Harris, or Dave Franco and Jenna Malone. All these characters just in this really horrible place together that Kate O'Brien's character Jackie is coming through and witnessing and starting to take part in. And just the setting also, setting it in that reality before we really get into the surreal. One set that kind of stood out to me was Dave Franco and Jenna Malone's house, because it looks like a relatively decent-sized house from the outside, but when we're actually inside, everything looks, like, really cramped. Like, the chair's, like, really close to the TV, and the kitchen's, like, right here, and everybody's sort of packed in here. There's a lot of kids running around. It feels like a house I had been in many times at one point or another in my childhood. Where it's like just the crampedness of it felt very real. And also talking about the real vibe, there's also, I think something that adds to the sexy nature that people often talk about with this movie is the reality of the scenes between Jackie and Lou, Kristen Stewart's character. When they have these intimate scenes together, and it's those moments where like it's very clumsy. Like they're bumping into things, they're knocking things off the wall, they're saying sorry, stuff like that, and like they'll acknowledge it with a laugh or something. And then it'll kind of like it kind of gives it this grounded nature before it goes into this sort of steaminess that you would expect from a more sort of produced kind of movie, I guess you could say. And then yeah, like I said, I feel like all of this setup for how grounded the world is later to be intentionally contrasted by this sort of hallucinatory factor. Once Jackie's drugs really start to kick in, and she kind of takes on another form, not just physically in her mind, but in personality, in just person in general. Especially the more she's kind of pulled into Ed Harris's side of this world. And we see like all these different kinds of power at play. Where like we talked about Lou's independence, and we've got Jackie like on the steroids, and she's like super. She was already super built, and then she's got this drug on top of it. It's making her practically monstrous. One of her family members on the phone actually calls her a monster at one point, and that's like just a little hint of a backstory we don't get in full. And then there's Ed Harris, who's just, brute force, who's just like guns and murder and remorselessness and all that. And it's like just everything in this environment is just totally toxic. All the relationships are toxic. Jenna Malone especially has to play a very complicated character because she's a character that we just sympathize for, and then, unfortunately, in a very real way, for very real reasons, she becomes an infuriating character. But she's only infuriating because of how much we care for her. And she has very little screen time, and she's able to pull that off and make this character feel like, as soon as she makes a particular emotional turn in, like, her last couple of scenes, it's like, we hate that that's her character and the direction her character is going, but at the same time, it's like, that makes sense. Like, we know this. We know this. We know why this character is the way this is, and the way that goes in tone with what the movie also seems to be romanticizing from Lou and Jackie's point of view is I'm really trying to dance around the spoilers here. I don't know how coherent this sounds, but if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. Where it's like that, and I don't think I can imagine the movie being criticized because it's like, oh, these are seen as like terrible relationships, but then what is Jackie and Lou? The movie knows what Jackie and Lou's relationship is, even at the end. That last shot speaks volumes about where this movie will go after the credits have finished. And it's fucking bleak. Like, the movie knows that. I don't think... The movie is being romantic while being about as unromantic as you can get simultaneously. That's the real tightrope that Rose Glass and the creators are walking here. So... That and the performances of the two leads, obviously, also. And when I was talking about these sort of turns in character, we do get moments of violence that are shocking. Now, you can say, you'll read like a bunch of reviews and they'll say, oh, there's shocking violence, and it turns to shocking violence. And it's like, you see that so much, and it's like, yeah, it's violence, it's movie violence, we've seen it before. No, this is where I genuinely say the violence, especially the first violent scene, is quite shocking. This doesn't happen that often anymore, but it's a moment of violence, and there's one particular moment where I immediately, just instinctively, had to look away. Because it was so graphic and disgusting. And in your face. And it went on for, the camera lingers on the aftermath for quite some time, too. And that happens, at least a couple of times. But it's like we've kind of built and built and built to this violence before it happens, yet it still blindsides us with just how violent it is and how graphic it is. But when we reach that point after we've looked away from the screen, it feels appropriate. Like, it makes sense that it built to that much gore and violence. So it doesn't feel like literal overkill when we get to that point. It feels earned. It's just also very... Yeah, that jolt is where the craft of the movie really comes in. Another thing that works really well in establishing this tone is the use of sound can be really disorienting in this way that's also intended to be disorienting. Whether it be like the drug effects or especially the whole Vegas scene has this sort of distorted sound going on that's like really jarring in this really great way and effective way. But it does eventually get to a point where you're kind of questioning throughout the movie how campy is it right now and how campy is it going to get. And by the time we get to the third act, it's like kind of fully embraced it. And so, it embraces it in a way that I don't know it completely did in the first two acts. So I'm not quite sure how I feel about the third act in total. It's a very entertaining third act. It was like when we get to her final confrontation with Jenna Malone, Kristen Stewart's, and she has that moment of aggravated love. And it's like she says a line off screen as she's leaving. It's a fantastic delivery and really shows what not just her, the character, is feeling, but how we, the audience, feel about the Jenna Malone character at this point. And it's perfect. But it also just feels very comedic in a way, and passive in a way. But it also feels like we've been through the ringer of the movie up to this point, like the characters. So it's just like exhaustion at this point of all the shit that's gone down as it's ramping up to its final moments that should be the most intense. And yeah, I like it, but I don't know how much it completely adds up tonally. Because there are plenty of suspenseful scenes, there's plenty of surreal scenes, and the way these all kind of blend at the same time as we get to the climax, it gets wild. It's a little risky to go as far as it does in its final moments, but as far as like the hallucinatory nature of it all. But I feel like the very last scene where it fully embraces all these people are fucked, but at least a couple of them might be happy while they're, fucked in all the different variations of the term. It's bleak in a way that really understands where it's coming from, and it's bleak. It's not some misguided movie that like thinks this is, the good people and the happy people, and these people are the bad people. It's all just a really shitty world. And it's just who do you want most to get out of this, if anybody, even if it's going to be bad for everybody. But like I said, for movies to just embrace that, if the characters are entertaining enough and you care enough about them, and the movie pulls you in enough and pulls you into its world enough, whether it's the visual way or the way it uses the audio, whatever. If it has you, it will have you. And for the most part, this movie does do that. I guess one thing that was a little jarring noticeably was the way the Jackie character seems to kind of get sidelined a little bit towards as we're kind of getting into the third act. But it's still a really, really solid and brutal movie and a very memorable movie. So and a great sort of second round for Rose Glass, and it's like to see what she did with Saint Maud and now this, it's like I will certainly be there to find out what in God's name could possibly be next for this, and how visually great it will be, or technically all of that. Who's going to work with her next will be something really interesting, because these are also that case where it's like these characters feel so in with this world. It'll be interesting to see what other actors she can pull into different worlds that she sets up so vividly and beautifully. So yeah, I do really like that one. So, going into Immaculate, which will be our last one here, I was... okay, so here's the thing. To my understanding, this and The First Omen only came out like a week or two apart. And obviously they're very similar. And the thing about it was, I guess a lot of... like, when one is talked about, the other is also talked about. And so, before I saw Immaculate, I was thinking, like, I'm not gonna be that person that's just saying, like, oh, there's this, but then The First Omen kind of made it... because I saw The First Omen first. I think a lot of people saw Immaculate first. But the thing about it is, I wanted to be the person that was like, I'm not gonna just say, like, oh, there's this, but The First Omen also did this, and that's the whole thing. But then, I was watching Immaculate after already having seen The First Omen, and it was like, well, shit. It's pretty impossible to ignore that these movies are nearly identical. So, that's... and The First Omen was like, at least part of a franchise, so it made sense if we were feeling familiar beats in it. This is intended to be like its own thing, and has a million familiar beats in it. Even without The First Omen, still, the woman is pregnant with what could be a demon baby, or Satan's baby, or some religious monster of sorts. We've seen this so many times, from so many different countries. There's like 1,000 woman's pregnant with a monster baby movies that have religion in them. So it's like, what can you bring, even without The First Omen being in this conversation at all, what new thing can you even do with this? Well, I will say, the opening was fantastic, because the way it's an opening that's terrifying on two levels. Because there's the opening itself, where it's like, it's kind of something we've seen before, where, you know, somebody's trying to get away, and they're being pursued by dark figures. We don't know what's going on, we don't know if this is some kind of cover-up, or just some blatant murder, or whatever it is. And it's brutal and scary, and then it cuts to black. But then, just as you think that's the opening, and you think you're about to see the title, there's one more level to this opening, where we fade back in, and then the fate is even worse than it seemed for this person. Then we get the opening. And so that, I thought, was really effective, where it's like, you think you're seeing this general sort of, oh, that's a pretty scary opening, but that's grabbed me, okay? But then just that sort of extra mile, just that extra moment of terror and torture for this character, kind of really set a vibe. This movie wasn't gonna really give you the thing you're expecting and then leave. It's like I'm gonna make it linger a little bit and then maybe torture you just a little longer. So that set a vibe that didn't really come. Pretty much the rest of the movie feels like a movie we've seen a million times before. It does feel, you know, like cinematically old-fashioned. Like, we've got those really nice sort of wide shots and the interesting framing and all that feels kind of well framed, but also slightly off. And there's something sort of askew about everything that gives you just enough discomfort. And the use of the music and the setting and all that. I'm not really sure what time period we're set in, because I did think this ended up working in its favor. I kind of just automatically assumed we were back in time. And we were like, you know, maybe 100 years back or something, or nearly 100 years back or something. And then Sydney Sweeney comes in, and it's like, Sydney Sweeney's somebody that just has a particularly modern look, if that makes sense. Like, she looks like somebody that's hanging out here in 2024, in that setting. And while it seems like that could be, like, maybe it's miscasting or whatever, I think the reason it works is because it feels like she's misplaced. Like, it feels like she's in a place that she's not supposed to be, with things happening that she doesn't understand, or something malicious or something terrifying is happening. And there's just, I've talked about that, about horror movies and appropriately feeling out of place. Where, like, that's kind of one of the scariest situations, is kind of being in a place you suddenly feel like you're not supposed to be, and you're trapped there. is something that'll always freak me out in horror movies. So that's something where it's kind of like the fact that she feels like she's from a different era entirely amplifies more. It feels like the character's in a place that she's not supposed to be. So it does have that going for it. But there's also like this the music that plays like that sort of Italian music that's playing is also something that feels kind of modern, and like almost anachronistic in the setting. So that's, like I said, that kind of not being sure where we are in the setting, I feel like actually works as far as setting a discomfort level for the audience. We are obviously going to have to deal with jump scares because it is going to be that kind of movie. They weren't as like there's not as many of them as I would have expected. Once the tone was kind of set, like we do have one that feels sort of inspired by the big one in The Ring, where we saw Amber Tamblyn in the closet, where it's like where she's talking and she's talking softly and she's giving her backstory, and then there's just a very sudden loud cut to this backstory that she's telling. That it felt very Ring inspired. There's a moment where a figure is standing in the dark that feels very much like a moment in Hereditary, or that moment in Smile, where it's like props to doing that, without the score, without the big jump noise. But still, like, Hereditary and Smile are both pretty recent, and kind of gave that same vibe. But it's still a well-done scare, just something that, we've seen before. Shock surprise, we've got another horror movie where a bird hits a window. So, the stuff like that, it's all stuff that feels like we've seen it before in different contexts. But it still has its moments. There's a surprisingly lighthearted montage kind of in the middle here where we see her kind of doing her tasks and stuff like that, and then it sort of ends in this sort of eerie moment. Like, the way it transitions from this happy montage to this sort of eerie moment is really well done. There's also a moment in this montage that's, kind of upbeat that kind of plants a seed for something that happens later. Like, one of her tasks may or may not have a place in something that she tries later in the movie. So kind of setting that up and planting that seed was nicely done. Using that also. Using this, montage that feels like it's just, oh, we're setting up the happy before it gets scary. And there's stuff in there. So the way they used that was nice. But also, like we were just talking about with Love Lies Bleeding, for being a horror movie, the gore is sparse, but I think it's utilized well because it's not often, but there will be moments that are surprisingly gruesome. Where, like, there's a moment where we kind of think we've seen something happen, and that's the extent of the drama. And then we see the aftermath of it. And it's surprisingly good. It's another one of those cases I was talking about with Love Lies Bleeding, where you kind of instinctively have to kind of dodge it. Because it's more gory than you're probably thinking it's going to be. Which is good, which is a compliment. Because of the way they set it up and the fact that they don't overuse it. It's a compliment. And then there's a de-tonguing that is witnessed from a distance. And while it's like, a torture scene isn't new to horror fans, it's the very matter-of-fact way this tongue is cut off. Where it's like the people that are doing it are like, you can tell, it's like they've done it 100 times. And it's like, oh, here's another de-tonguing, here we go. And it's like, there's something really upsetting about that in this really effective way. So, a good job for that also. But yeah, honestly, there's not really much to say about this movie because it's very short, and it's like we recognize all of its beats, and then it basically feels like it's just building up to this ending. And it's like, the ending can probably, I imagine it's going to be one of those cases where people feel like they've left a more powerful movie because of how it ends, kind of forgetting that the rest of the movie that comes before the ending was just all the shit we've seen before. So when we do get to this ending, it's one of those cases where you have to ask for a lot of physicality from Sydney Sweeney. She's got to do like a full-on horror movie scream multiple times. It's asking for a big long take, and it's brutal and uncompromising, and then it just cuts to black. And it's a good ending. It's a strong ending, but it does feel like if the rest of the movie had been half as sort of powerful as the imagery we get in the last shot, it could have been a really strong movie. And that's not to say, it probably sounds like I'm being more dismissive than I intend to be, because it's not a bad movie, and I wasn't frustrated with it in the way I am with a lot of movies that hit similar beats, or don't feel particularly original. Because there is definitely, it's very well made, and obviously Sweeney is great, especially in her last moments. And the range she's showing as an actress lately, also, like, it does seem like it's one of those, oh, she's just one of those people that's just being cast in everything. Like she's, like a new Tom Holland or something, where it's like, oh, because we don't really have any creativity, we'll just put her at the top of casting choices for any, female role. No, she's definitely shown that she can do a number of different things, all very well, different genres, different kinds of characters. So that's great, and it's obviously going to be great to watch her continue as she finds more roles that ask this much from her, and that she can bring it in more. Yeah, this it's just your basic ass pregnant with a maybe demon baby, maybe the devil's baby, maybe deformed baby Jesus, whatever it may be. It's the same as every other pregnancy horror movie, more or less. So, but it's very well made and has some very interesting, like I said, kind of modern touches in it. And that goes along for a horror movie. Being well made goes a very long way. So that I can commend it for. So, I think that's all we have to talk about here. So, the next thing, it's either going to be 3 more movies, or it's going to be, I still need to do the Speaking Bluntly for If. It's going to be one of those. But either way, both of those will be coming and continuing this onwards. So, until the next thing, I think that's it.